Oh wow, it's almost six. It is 6 o'clock. So I guess I should go ahead and get started. For those that don't know me, my name is John Watts, and I am with Watts Digital Imaging here in San Diego, California. I'm a post-processing specialist for photographers, and my motto is, "You take the perfect shot, and I'll help you get the absolute most out of it, your printer or mine." And I can help you in three distinct ways: Photoshop instruction and services, LightJet digital printing and finishing, and color management products and services. In 1979 and 1983, I came out to California for surfing and discovered the 1 hour lab craze. And since I was a photographer anyway, I decided, well, this is kind of fun. So I got into the whole post-processing aspect of photography. And as you can see, this is my picture today, and I'm just as handsome. I may lack a little bit in the, well, let's just say I'm follicle challenged. Let's go on to the next slide here. Watts Color Lab in 1984. We discovered the joys of self-employment and started Watts Color Lab, which is prints enlargement from slides and transparencies. And we have an analog enlarger here on the left picture and a photographic paper processor. This technology hasn't really changed too much, but this is a photographic processor for type R prints and enlargements from slides and transparencies only. Before I go any further, I want to thank you for attending tonight. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. I will be working on a Mac, but don't let that slow you down. I will be working on the latest Photoshop Creative Cloud version. And again, don't let that slow you down, because the information I'm going to show you goes back a version or two. But if you're not using Creative Cloud, you probably should consider it. There's all sorts of information on my webpage about that. You'll hear me refer to this a lot tonight, the useful downloads page. And there's a whole bunch of free resources on the useful downloads page. By the way, before I go any further, when you go to the very first page in the notes, you're going to find a whole bunch of links. Oh, also, there's a 20 to 80 rule when you're dealing with a subject like this, where you're going to remember 10, 20% of what we talk about tonight, particularly since it's a highly technical kind of subject. The other 80% is homework, or as Priscilla, who is one of our attendees again, we're going to call it the Priscilla rule, is that the 80% is homework. Thank you, Priscilla, for that. I think that's a great explanation of the 80% part. Chances are you won't retain tonight is somewhere in the notes, or if it's not, you can always email me and we can go from there. A little bit more about me here. This is the modern equivalent of my old analog enlarger. This is a digital printer right here. We print with light and not with ink. Those are two light jets. They print with red, green, and blue lasers on 50-inch wide by however many feet paper. And it's quite the operation. But like the old technology, we still process the same way. Developer, bleach fix, wash, drying, all that kind of stuff. Again, like I said, there's three ways I can help you, and that's one, I can help you with high-end digital printing. Again, you can see some other pictures in here. I have done a lot of public speaking over the years. Of course, that's kind of been restricted to the internet for the last 4 months or so. I've done a lot of judging, and I hopefully will continue to do a lot more judging, including the San Diego County Fair and Orange County Fair photo exhibits. Again, I'm a grandpa, and that's my youngest right there, who's now 7 years old. Actually, I take that back. He's now 8 years old. My, how time flies. This is how best to learn Photoshop through these meetups. The top half of this here is all free stuff and effort on your part, and that includes attending all 5 of the Photoshop 101 meetups, even if not sequentially. And we're on number 2 tonight out of 5. Homework, again, you'll hear me stress this a lot throughout the seminar, that you spend some time, and we'll call it the Priscilla rule, that you spend some time at your computer, at least an hour a week, with Photoshop. And there's all sorts of videos that are linked in the notes that we'll discuss as we go along. I suggest that you make that homework also. And as always, if you have any questions, please contact me. My preferred method of communication is email, mainly because I have been playing drums for over 50 years and I have the hearing that goes with it. If we need to set up a phone conference, that's fine. We just need to set that up by email first. At the bottom half here, some other things that are going to help you learn this crazy program called Photoshop. One is to buy my book. It's available on Amazon. There is a link at the front. It's called Not Just Another Photoshop Book, and I think that pretty much explains itself. It's designed for photographers by a photographer. to show you how to use those functions of Photoshop that you really need and want and desire. The rest of them you can pretty much forget. It's a very complex program, as you'll find out. Small group workshop meetups. Eventually, once the COVID-19 situation shakes itself out, I may end up just creating a video course for that instead. Again, if you need any kind of print or color management products and services, you need custom printer profiles for your printer, I can create those for you. You need any kind of special photographic print project, whether it's mounted on, let's say, acrylic or even ultra board or gator foam or any of that kind of stuff, I can help you with all of that. I'm going to spend very little time on this slide. Know that this is homework. I suggest that you go to the link in the front, Photoshop versus Lightroom, wrong question, and there will be a link to 2 other posts related to this same subject. This is part 1, which I'm talking about here, and it will really ask you, do you really need Lightroom? Part 2, and by the way, there's a link to part 2 and 3 in this part 1 blog post. Part 2 asks, if so, are you going to use Adobe Camera Raw plugin or develop module to accomplish those goals that you need for your raw file? And then part 3 is, if you are indeed a dedicated Lightroom user, how do I migrate properly? So I'm not going to go any further with that. Just know that I am not a big fan of Lightroom for a multitude of reasons. I use Bridge, which I talk about right here, instead of Lightroom for my file browser. So let's go ahead and move, and that's what I will be using tonight also. Let's go ahead and move on to the next subject. And I'm also actually on page 1. And you'll also hear me call out page numbers for the book, for those that have my book. So we're on page 1 in the notes, page 3 in the book. And when it comes to a good color print, it's essential that you know what you're aiming for before you can properly use the tools in Photoshop. I mean, what is color anyway? Get ready to find out, because we're going to talk about that specifically tonight. I'm going to show you how to use levels and Hue Saturation Adjustment layers to take care of your contrast and color needs both globally and locally using the acronym K.I.S S. Keep it super simple to drive home my point. And with a well-exposed image, these 2 tools may be all that you need to properly optimize your image for contrast and color both globally and locally. And now you see a picture here of a manual transmission versus an automatic transmission. Those that know me also know that I'm an automotive buff and have been for years, and so I use a lot of automotive analogies. And this is one that I think you'll appreciate. You can think of my teaching method or philosophy, if you will, as being analogous to a manual transmission versus an automatic transmission in a car. And a manual transmission is mechanically simple, but will give you tons of control and high performance over your automobile. I mean, they don't use automatic transmissions in NASCAR or any kind of professional racing after all. But it does come with a price. There's a learning curve, hand-eye, foot coordination, and so on. And after time, using a manual transmission becomes very instinctive. You don't really even need to think about stalling the car anymore. I mean, I know when I first learned, I stalled the car a lot. These days, I have an old Ford Explorer 4x4 that I keep around with a manual transmission, and once a week I go and drive it because it's just fun to drive. But mechanically, it's very simple. It gives me lots of control and performance. And yes, automatic transmissions have their uses, don't get me wrong, but I do teach a manual transmission method because I want to get the absolute most out of my image. You can almost think of it as a Taurus, and I own a Taurus, so I can say that as a Taurus versus a Ferrari, where I'm going to teach you the Ferrari, not the Taurus. You'll also notice that I said simple and not easy, and there is a difference because nothing good in life is ever easy. And a good example I like to use is digging a hole in dirt. And that's simple, most definitely, but it's not necessarily easy. I am saying that it's simple with tons of control performance, but it's not necessarily easy. Again, going back to the automotive analogy with starting to learn to drive a manual transmission. What you see here is a visual representation of a proper workflow for photographers in Photoshop. There is a workflow chart if you have my book or you go to the useful downloads page that will give you a linear representation of this, 1 through whatever. This is just kind of to give you an idea of what's going on. So you'll hear me refer to the workflow chart a lot tonight. If you have not downloaded that, you can download it for free on the useful downloads page. We're going to basically covering just the left side of this master file workflow that we're looking at here. If a picture is truly worth, and by the way, I'm on page 2 and page 7 in the book. If a picture is truly worth 1,000 words, then here's the overall visual representation of the workflow chart. What is a master file? Let's go ahead and go to the next page and I'll move on here. By the way, I should also mention on page 2, about halfway down, I put creating a master file is not for every image. It's only for those images that you want to spend time with doing all that's necessary to make your image pretty. It's where you're going to pour your Photoshop mojo, your artistic blood, sweat, and tears into your image. And if I can go back to this just for a second, it's this left-hand side of this visual representation. And we're going to be covering contrast, hue, saturation. We're going to be covering quite a bit of this on the left-hand side tonight, just to kind of keep you an idea of what's going on. So what is a master file? As you can see, and this is also on page 2, page 7 in the book, it's a 16-bit, unflattened, unsharpened, uncropped, unresized file designated as such in its file name. If a lot of those terms don't make sense to you now, they will after you've taken all 5 of these classes. Why create a master file? Number one, because it's multi-purpose. You can use it for a multitude of different output. For instance, for the San Diego County Fair, you should create your master file, pour your blood, sweat, and tears into the left side of this chart so you have a master file. If you enter in Tier 1 in the San Diego County Fair, you're just going to send an electronic entry. So you would go through the chart on the right and create a save to size for the web. If you make it to Tier 2, then lo and behold, you come back to your master file and go through this chart again, but this time it said you're going to save it for print, which is totally different output. But you only did all the blood, sweat, and tears and what have you for the master file once. So that's what I mean by multi-purpose. It's easily correctable because, as you can see, we're going to work in adjustment layers, and when you work in adjustment layers coupled with layer mask, then it's easily correctable. You only sharpen the size, and I mentioned this in the class 1, well, 2 weeks ago, that if you, let's say you have a master file that comes out the average of, usually it's say 12 by 18 inches by 300 ppi. If you sharpen your master file and decide you only need an 8 by 10, you've already over sharpened your image, so you only sharpen to size. You want to save your master files as TIFFs or PSDs, not JPEGs. And we talked about that a lot in class 1, where a JPEG is only 8-bit. You can't save it in 16-bit. You also cannot save in layers in a JPEG. Plus, it also has lossy compression every time you open, work on, and save a JPEG. So I save my master files. I prefer PSDs, but that's just for me more than anything. Either one works. Once you read through the notes a little more, perhaps, or the book, you'll know a little more. There's no difference between a TIFF or a PSD for all practical purposes. There are some advantages to the PSD. For one, the file, let's say you got a 500 megabyte file in TIFF, it may only be 300 megabytes or 350 in a PSD, because PSD and TIFF both have lossless, not lossy, but lossless compression, meaning that it does not throw out any information at all. So I want to let you know that what I've talked about here at the master file is really all about class 4, which is coming up in about 3 weeks. But in the meantime, you can go to the link at the front of the notes, and there is a free Photoshop 101 videos page, and there's a free master file creation study video that includes a PDF with very extensive notes, a table of contents, and a workflow chart, amongst other things. It is long. It's 1 hour and 20 minutes long, and that's why I call it a study video. Just keep that in mind. I don't expect you to sit down and watch the whole thing. How do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant one bite at a time. So take 10 or 15 or 20 minutes at a time. I mean, you got a table of contents so that you can pace yourself when you're going through these. These are fully annotated with extra highlighting and arrows and stuff that if you attended this back in April, you may not realize that a lot of this stuff was even being presented. I think you'll enjoy it. There is also a link at the very first page called What is a Master File and Why Do I Need One? And that'll explain a lot more about what I'm talking about on this page. 2 questions here. Ashif asks, can a PSD file be opened without Photoshop? No, with the exception of possibly the preview applications in Mac or PC, and I'm not even so sure about PC. It is a proprietary format, but you shouldn't have to be opening your master file in anything but Photoshop anyway, so that's why I like the .psd format. Priscilla also asks, would you then save as a TIFF or as a JPEG? Priscilla, it really depends on the output. If I save my master file, let's go back to this for a second. If I save my master file as a PSD, and then I need to send, let's say that at the end of this visual representation, I need to send an email, a JPEG for tier 1, then in that case, you're going to want to send that JPEG. If instead I'm going to print, you can send it as a high-res JPEG, but most labs are going to want it as a TIFF. I hope that makes sense, Priscilla. Okay, groovy. I just dated myself by saying groovy, didn't I? Okay, we're on page 3 of the notes and page 29 if you were in the book. And this is really the question you should be asking yourself: what makes a good print? And how do we use the basics of Photoshop to achieve the desired results? There are a few definitions in order, and I'm going to get to those as we go along, but let's go ahead and look at this chart, which I put together on the PowerPoint slide as well as on page 3 and 29 in the book. And on the chart on the page 3, you'll see the corresponding basic tools in Photoshop. You'll see levels, hue saturation, so on and so forth. So all we're going to cover tonight are the first 4. Contrast only. What am I saying? That's a lot. Contrast, hue, color balance, color saturation, and luminance brightness. We're not going to get into sharpening or cropping or taking zits off of your teenager or any of that kind of stuff. We're going to touch a little bit on this 8th one here in just a second, but let me give you some definitions. The first one would be, and these definitions, by the way, are also on page 3. Contrast is the difference in brightness between the light and dark areas of an image. So a high contrast image, this is 2 different images with the proper contrast in the middle. A high contrast image is kind of harsh and highlights are washed out, the shadow detail is blocked up. Whereas a low contrast image is kind of flat and lifeless. There's generally no black or anything like that. It's just mostly midtones more than anything. So proper contrast has something in between where we got plenty of shadow detail. We're not washing out any of the highlights, but it has enough pop, if you will, so that it's jumping out at you. And that's true of both of these images. There is also a definition, let's see here, on page 3, page 29 of the book, in the box. By the way, if you ever see a box anywhere in my notes or in my book, it's usually something that's one of those 20% things you want to remember. There's a dictionary definition of color on page 3, but just keep in mind for a photographer, the 3 main attributes, components of color are hue, saturation, and luminance, or brightness. It's pretty much the same thing. So let's talk about each one of those so you know what they mean. There's a definition again at the bottom of page 3. A hue is a single color cast or color name. Green is a hue, orange is a hue, red is a hue. There's an infinite number of hues in nature. Saturation is the intensity or purity of a hue. A pastel red is less saturated than, say, a fire engine red. Lime green has more saturation than, say, a chiffon green, so on and so forth. By the way, in color photography, 0% saturation is a black and white image, just so you know. If it's oversaturated, it tends to look kind of Andy Warholish and unreal and electric, and so we don't want to do that. Now let's talk about hues, and you'll see some hues up in here that each one of these images has a separate hue to it. Now, let me come back to that, and instead let me go to page 4. And this is real quick because this is almost a part of your homework, if you will. Page 4, page 30 in the book. What makes a photograph unique? Remember I mentioned there were 8 basic elements of a good color print, and this is number 8, that wow factor. And you can see, well, again, on the notes, how do you increase your wow factor? Increase its uniqueness. And what makes a photograph unique? To me, as a judge and as someone who is a student of photography, that's what sets an image apart from others. How many images have we all seen of the Coronado Bridge, but how many of them really stand out? And it's usually because one of the 5 things that are listed on page 4, page 30 in the notes, is unique compared to other images, whether it's subject, the thing itself, detail, frame, how it's composed, vantage point's a big one, and time. So I'm not going to spend any more time with that. I just want to give you a little heads up that part of your photography is not something I can necessarily show you, which is the actual taking of the image. I can show you what you do with your image after the fact. As a digital post-processing specialist. So this is one of those things that people ask me all the time. What are you looking for in a great image? And that's what I'm looking for. By the way, John Sierkowski is the one who kind of came up with this. He is the one who came up with these back in the 60s. And if you Google John Sierkowski 5 characteristics, you're going to find a zillion different interpretations of what these 5 things mean. And let's talk about the color wheel a little bit. I'm on page 5 in the notes and page 35 in the book. Color correction in the color wheel. The color in my print doesn't look right. And how many of us have heard this? So there's 2 bullet points there, which will give you an idea of what this whole color wheel thing is all about. Color correction is correcting an imbalance in the color cast of the image. Use the color wheel, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to help you determine the proper color balance. There's a box there on page 5, page 35 in the book, the very first box. It says, when judging for proper color balance in your image, look for neutrals such as white or gray. Correct for those neutrals and the rest of your colors generally will fall into place. So how does this color wheel thing fall into place? Well, let's talk about the primary colors first, which are red, green, and blue. We've all heard the phrase RGB, and that's where it comes from. The complementary colors to these, which are across from them in the color wheel, the complementary color of red is cyan, complementary color of green is magenta, and the complementary color of blue is yellow. And if you've ever heard the phrase CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and K for black ink. To correct an image with an improper color cast, add its complementary color to bring the color balance back to where it needs to be. So if your image has a red color cast, you're going to add some cyan to it. If it has a blue color cast, you're going to add some yellow to it, so on and so forth. And it talks about this all on page 5. So an example, let's say that you're looking at the neutrals in the image, the color cast is 2 magenta, then you would add some green to correct the proper color balance, like I showed you here a minute ago. However, this is really oversimplifying things quite a bit, because in the real world, true primary colors don't exist. Bottom line, you probably need to use 2 colors in your RGB settings in Photoshop to correct your image. As an example, let's say your image has an orange cast, which is yellow plus red. You would add a combination of blue and or cyan, the complementary colors, to correct. And I'll show you some real world examples, y'all's images here in just a little bit. Rules are made to be broken, so you should know that the neutral rule doesn't always apply. The best example of that is the sunset. I mean, you don't want to make a sunset neutral, for goodness sake. That's part of the appeal of a sunset. So if you want a free printable JPEG of this color wheel, you can go to that useful downloads page and print this out and tape it up next to your computer. And let me show you some examples. What do we got here? Okay, I just checking my notes here. So let me go back in history here, just on my PowerPoint, just a little bit. And here's an image that I said had a red hue bias. What do we judge our color balance by? We're going to judge them by looking at the neutrals. Well, this is Mount Whitney, and as you can see in the middle, that the mountains are indeed gray and the snow is indeed white. So if I look in the grays of Mount Whitney here at the top, it's got a red bias and a magenta bias and a blue bias and so on around the horn. And this, by the way, what you see here, these examples correspond to the color wheel that I showed you just a few minutes ago. So what we would do is, if this image has a blue bias, we would add some red, or if it's a bluish cyanish bias, we would add some red and some yellow to bring it back to a neutral. I hope that kind of makes sense to everybody. Okay, let's go to page 6. So we're going to talk about layers and layers panel basics on page 6. If you're in the book, we're on page 65 and 67. I'm just skipping a little bit ahead in this section of the book about adjusting your contrast and color, because you need to get an idea of what we're talking about tonight here with these layer masks. Let's talk about adjustment layers more than anything. This is a screen grab of the layers panel in Photoshop, which you'll see a lot of tonight. And I've made kind of a 3-dimensional exploded view, if you will, of what that looks like. You can think of an adjustment layer as a clear plastic overlay that's just over your image, and one clear plastic overlay may adjust just contrast, and another one will adjust hue saturation, and so on and so forth. You don't see a layer mask in your final output, only the results. It's invisible and works in the background. And we're not going to do much in the way of localizing our adjustments. We're going to work globally, but just remember that black hides and white reveals the effects of your adjustment layer. So for this adjustment layer here, levels 1, which is just mostly contrast, you can see that white reveals the sky. That's what that thing is. I really should put a picture of that image up here so you can see what I'm talking about that. I'll do that next time. But in the meantime, I hope that kind of makes sense. I just want you to get an idea of what all these layers, an unflattened master file is all about. Every time you make an adjustment on one of these adjustment layers, it does not degrade your image with pixelization and posterization, which is the main reason, one of the main reasons that we work with layer mask and adjustment layers. Let's see here. I think that pretty much covers that. Let's go ahead and go into, this is not really in the notes per se. I just want, what we've kind of talked about here is basic adjusting contrast and color, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. I have a system, which you're going to see tonight, where you rarely use, in fact, I never use the generic controls or adjustments like, what do they call it? Color balance and brightness contrast. Instead, I use a combination of levels and or Hue Saturation tools. It's just my manual transmission. On most images, these may be the only two adjustment layers that you'll need for contrast and color. Even if it involves multiple levels and Hue Saturation adjustment layers because you're isolating stuff with layer mask. But either way, I'll show you an example of an image here in just a minute. So again, think the manual versus automatic transmission. The manual transmission is where you're using levels and Hue Saturation to do most of your heavy lifting rather than the color balance tool and the contrast and brightness tools. Okay, hope that makes sense. Okay, let me open, there we go. And as you can see, I've conveniently put a color wheel chart down here for us to use later. Now this is an image that ended up being, oh my gosh, it was a huge face mask. And you can see over here, and I'm gonna drag this layers panel out a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm talking about as to how many layers there really is in this thing. Each one of these is doing something to a specific, in other words, I'm localizing the image. There's very little of this that's actually done globally. Here's what I started with. Let's see, do I have this in a group? I do. This is what the photographer gave me. First thing I did is I went through and created a background copy, and we're going to talk about those a little bit tonight. It's just it's an exact copy of the image below it, but what I've done is I've used the cloning tools and various tools to get rid of all the stuff that he wanted to get rid of, extra fish and what have you. Yeah, that's the before image right there, Priscilla, except for where I adjusted. This is what I adjusted and brought out a raw. So the next thing I did is I added a background copy, which is an exact copy of the one below it, except that in the background copy, I've done all of the cloning that needs to be done. All of these are separate layers. I just happen to have them grouped so you can see, but if you turn it on, you can see the difference I'm able to make. Now that's group here consists of what, 10 or 11 different layers. For instance, right here, and I'll just show you, part of this is in the regular book, as well as the layer mask book, as well as on the blog. There's a layer mask basics part 1. There's a part 2, the part 3 coming. But when I talked about black hides, white reveals, black means nothing's getting through on this adjustment, which is a levels adjustment. Here's, but so all I'm adjusting is just the background. So I'll turn that off, and you can see the difference I'm able to make just on that, so on and so forth. So I want to give you an idea how all these levels work. Here's one that's just for the shark. There's before, and there's after isolating and zoning, after creating a separate zone for the shark. In fact, we even got so crazy on this particular one that we were isolating just certain areas of the image, like the forward area, to lighten it. My big point is, if you'll notice, almost everything is levels, Hue Saturation, levels, Hue Saturation. I practice what I preach, and that's the main thing I wanted you to get out of that, to get an idea how these how they look visually, and also to give you an idea what we're going to be working on tonight so you're not lost with that. Let's talk about the layers panel. This is on page 6, page 65 through 67 in the book. The layers panel is the panel over here. Remember, we talked about workspace and panels in class 1. And layers panel and properties panel, which we'll use a lot tonight, are the two that you're going to really be familiar with, and they're interactive. They're kind of linked, I guess is a good way to put it. So the layers panel is where you manage all of your layers, including adjustment layers, which is mainly what we're dealing with here. You can think of it as a two-dimensional side view of your original image, starting with the background layer being your original image. A background layer is the image you bring into Photoshop. That's right down here. The active layer is the one that's highlighted. So for instance, right now, this one that's darker gray is the one that's active. You can control the layer visibility by clicking on and off on the eyeball to the left of the layer. So I showed you this earlier. Right now, you can see that I haven't done anything to the background until I turn this eyeball, the visibility, back on. The properties panel. And the properties panel, remember we had the layers panel and the properties panel, and this is on page 7 and page 69 in the book. The properties panel has two views, the adjustment properties view, which is where it's in now, and then the mask properties view, which I can click on here. There's a button right up here, and it shows the mask properties. Or if I click on a layer mask thumbnail in a particular adjustment layer, then it will also bring it to the mask. Or conversely, if I click on the adjustment, in this case layers, it will change it back. But you can always change them manually up here if you want. Okay, I've got this one still active. If I click the layer visibility off on this one, it also clicks the layer visibility off down here. They're like tied together. So if I click this one on, then it comes back on here. So there's really only a couple things you need to know about in this. The first is, let's see, well, actually 5 things, and it just shows you one. The first is there's a drop-down menu right here. By default, it's in the RGB composite menu. When we are adjusting contrast, and we'll talk about this later, this is where you're going to adjust it right here in the RGB composite. We can also go to red, green, and blue individual channels and adjust our overall color. The red, green, and blue, it's like putting color filters in front of your lens. So we can do a little overall global correction in levels also. And the second, third, and fourth things are these sliders here. There's a black slider here, a mid-tone slider, and a highlight slider. So you can call it shadow slider or black slider. And this one on the right, you can call highlight slider or white slider, either one. The mid-tone slider is right here, and that's the one that usually doesn't get moved near enough. We'll talk about those a little bit. So the 5 things, the drop-down menu, the black slider, the mid-tone slider, the highlight slider, and the eyeball, the layer visibility. You can ignore everything else in there, including the output levels. This gray bar down here, don't even touch it. So it's really more for CMYK output. Remember, you only need about 10 to 15% of this program, and that's one of those 85% of the things that you can ignore right down here on the properties panel. Let's go to page 8, and let's talk about the levels adjustment layer. And I'm done with the chart for now. What is the photo filter? Priscilla asked. The photo filter, let me hit cancel on that real quick. The photo filter is like placing a giant filter in front of your overall image, or you can isolate it to, I know I did it here somewhere, I'm just not sure where it is now. Oh, here it is. Where, like I added a warming filter to the shark. Let's see if it makes any difference. Here it is without, very subtle, and here's with, just to give it a little kind of a color oomph. And yeah, that's one I don't use very often, but if I know something needs warming up, I can use either the levels or I can just create the photo filter. It's not the kind of function like the contrast and brightness controls or the color balance controls that can degrade your image. Okay, let's go ahead and close this image and let me open some other ones here. Let's see, I'm going to open. So before I talk about levels and how to use them, I want to make you guys aware of something that I've done to every image here. Class 3 in 2 weeks is about how to work with your raw files properly. So I have taken all of these files and I have made them reach the 4 goals that we're going to talk about in class 3. The 4 goals are to bring your final raw image into Photoshop, slightly underexposed, low and flat in contrast, oversaturated, and best overall color balance. Again, if that doesn't make sense now, just know that what we're trying to do by following these goals is to bring more information into the visible spectrum. With that in mind, here is the image that I was given. So what I did is I took it into Adobe Camera Raw filter. Remember I talked about a background, which is our, here, look over on the right-hand side on the layers panel, you'll see the background. That's our original image. You can see the eyeball is on. I also created a background copy, which is just an exact duplicate of the background, but on the background copy only, I adjusted it using the Camera Raw filter built into Photoshop. If you have a raw file, I would bring it into Adobe Camera Raw, and we want raw files most of the time because this is only 8-bit. All I'm trying to do is bring more information back into the visible spectrum. And in order to do that, I follow these 4 goals that we talked about here. So I don't want to spend too much more time on that. I just want you to know that all of the images that we're going to look at tonight, and we're going to start with your images here shortly, are like that, where I have actually created a background copy, and you can see what it is I've done to it. So the purpose of, let's go to page 8, page 37, and the levels adjustment layer is used for contrast control and color correction, both in the same layer, and it's really versatile. And if I only had one function available to me in Photoshop, this would be it. It's that versatile. So, and it's entirely possible with a well-exposed image that you may not even have to break things down into zones and what have you. So the easiest way to create any kind of an adjustment layer is to either use the adjustments panel, which is one of those panels that I suggest that you have on your workspace, or you can use the little yin-yang symbol down here, and it will create a new filler adjustment layer, and you can see that levels is right here. I'm just going to use the adjustments panel for now. When I click on the levels button, you can see that immediately it adds a levels adjustment layer. Now remember, white reveals, so any adjustment I make with this levels is going to be global. And you can see that in my properties panel, when I did that it created exactly that. It showed us the levels and the properties, and we've got the 5 things, the drop-down menu, the 3 sliders, and the eyeball. Now let me go back in history and watch that again so you can see how I did that. And all I did was go to the adjustments panel and click on the levels button, which creates a new levels adjustment layer. Okay, histogram. Let's talk a little bit about a histogram here. The histogram is a graph that represents the total range of an image as measured in pixels. It basically tells you how your image is exposed. The higher the graph for a particular value, the more information there is at that level. So the left side of your histogram is dark pixels with 0 all the way to the left being black. The right side of the histogram represents light pixels with 255 being absolute white, and the middle of your histogram represents midtones with 1.00 being right in the middle. And don't let the value hang you up. It's just called gamma. I think the engineers have taken over, but it is midtone contrast control, and you'll see that in use in a bit. I think that covers page 8. Let's go to page 9 and page 38 in the book. Now, it says here, generally speaking, an image that is underexposed will have more value. Actually, you know what? Just instead of, I'm going to let you guys go through all of this here at the top of page 9 just for time, because I want you to see the 8 images that we have, and I need to get honking on those real quick. What's with the drop-down menu? Remember, there you can control both contrast and your overall color balance in levels. And if you remember in the flow chart that we talked about, you should adjust contrast first before you adjust your color balance. If you adjust your color balance first before your contrast and then adjust your contrast, it's probably going to throw your contrast out. So you want to, as it says on page 9, contrast first and then overall color balance. A couple of things I want to show you here, and I'm just going to leave this drop-down menu alone. The first thing you need to know is that there is a button, and it's talked about near the bottom of page 9. It's the clipping warning. And we're talking about, if anybody ever hear somebody say, well, I'm setting the white point and black point. This is essentially what we're kind of doing here. You hold down the Option key, Alt key on a PC, and that's listed on the second bullet point up on page 9. While you're moving the highlight or the shadow key, it will show you clipping. By the way, what is clipping? Clipping is the unwanted elimination of digital information, and we don't want that. So I'm going to move this slider. I'm holding down the Option key, Alt key on a PC, and sliding this to the left so we can quantify how far we want to go with this. It also says somewhere on page 9, don't use it as an absolute. If it starts clipping stuff, it may not be important. In fact, we got a couple good examples of that tonight. In fact, there's no detail in the antelopes, antlers, or yeah, whatever those are. So if I bring this a little bit lighter, I think that works better. Let's look what I've done just before and after. There's before and there's after. I can do the same thing, hold down the Option key, Alt key on a PC, and move my slider to the right. Now, just so you know, and I should show you this, you see that little peak of black right there? All that is the black around the outside edges of this image, which is originally from a 35 millimeter slide. So this is from a drum scan, and all you're seeing is just that black. Well, we really don't care whether we throw out those pixels. All we're worried about is really not losing any shadow detail in the underbelly of this elk. I think it's an elk. I'm going to hold this down, and again, I'm going to move this black slider. I'm holding down Option key, Alt on a PC, and moving it to the right. Well, again, you can see the clipping on the border, but again, we don't care. So I'm going to bring it over here, and you can see we're starting to throw little pixels out in that area where we're worried about. So we don't want to go too much farther than that. So here's before, and here's after. You can already see we're increasing the contrast. I'm going to go ahead and bring the highlight slider more to the left because it's just still too dark. Now, am I throwing stuff out? Yeah, but I'm throwing out colors we don't really want anyway, like the blue and the driftwood. Okay, the only thing we're really throwing out is any detail in the antlers, but in this image, there never was, so it's a moot point. So here's before, and here's after. Now, I can go back in history, too, in the upper right and do the same thing. I could start there. I added the levels layer, and I modified, and modified. That pretty much takes care of my contrast, if you ask me. That looks really, really good. So now we have a little bit of a color cast to the driftwood. Remember, we talked, we want to look at grays. Well, that wood is not electric blue. And no, that is not toilet paper. I've gotten that question over the years. It's a piece of driftwood. The fog in the background should be more of a neutral color. So I got a couple of choices here. I can do a coarse color adjustment by using the drop-down menu. Remember, I'm still on the levels adjustment layer. I use the drop-down menu, and we remember our color wheel. If it's blue in color, we want to add some yellow. So let's start there. Oops, there's no yellow. Well, yes, there is. Click on the blue channel, and the two sliders that you can move to the right will add yellow to the image. And I usually start with the midtone. Okay. And it looks like it's also got some cyan in it. So we're going to go ahead and add some red too. Now this one, since it's a primary, we can go ahead and move the two sliders that we can to the left to add red. Okay. Now I said coarse adjustment because if I were to adjust, let's say I take the slider here on yellow and I slide it over there and I go, okay, great, my neutrals are great. Well, no, it's not. Again, I said coarse, and so we don't want to get carried away with that. We're going to use a scalpel in a minute called the Hue Saturation Tool, but I just want to show you that. So here's before on this image, and there's after. You can already see an improvement, and all I've used is just the levels adjustment layer. And by the way, on the pages for the rest of the book, you'll have to go through those at your leisure, but I think that the more you see this being done, the more those notes will make sense, unless there's something in particular I've forgotten about, but I don't think so. The next thing I'm going to do, remember I said levels and Hue Saturation, that's the 1-2 punch. So I'm going to go back to the adjustments panel. I'm going to click on Hue Saturation. It's active because it's dark gray, but now we have a different properties. Some things I should say about the Hue Saturation. I almost never use the master channel. In fact, on this one, in the drop-down menu, you have not only the 3 primaries, but you got the 3 complementary colors that you can play with also. I almost never use the lightness control regardless. Now, if I were to use this saturation control on the master composite and I move it all the way to the left, then there's my cheap black and white. By the way, there are a million better ways to do that. I just want to show you what 0% saturation. If I go the other way, then we get the Andy Warhol effect. God bless him. I love this stuff. Okay, the colors that are bugging me are a cyanish blue in particular in the driftwood. So I'm going to go to the drop-down list on these properties. and I'm going to go to, let's start with cyans. And if you ever want to know how much of a particular color is in this, move the saturation slider to the right. A lot of cyan in there, okay? Let's go ahead and desaturate that. Remember, Hue saturation and lightness. Hue is a particular color cast. Saturation is the intensity or purity, and lightness is light or dark. But we don't need to change the hue of it. We just need to change the intensity of it. And it's not just cyan either. Let's go to the blue, and I'm going to go to the blue selection in the drop-down channel. How much of that is blue? Oh, a lot. So let's move that back. There we go. Okay, again, I don't want to go all the way, because you can see if I move the saturation all the way to 0, that up there, it just looks fake. We don't want to go crazy with it, but you get to a point where it's definitely helping you out, and that's what we're doing right here. The other thing, let's say we want to change the greens on this. We want to change the hue of the greens. The greens to me look too blue-green, so maybe we want them more of an olive green, kind of a yellow. There we go. See the difference? Let's start where I added a Hue saturation layer here, and then I changed it here. Or I can click it on and off here. Not bad, huh? You get the idea? And that's just with 2 adjustment layers and not breaking anything down. Could I have done better on this? Yes, but I want to get to y'all, so I need to kind of move along. Here's what we started with, and using Hue and saturation and levels, we ended up with that. Okay, let's get to y'all's images here. Okay, let's start with this one here. And I believe this is Joe's image. Here is what Joe gave me. And it's a nice image, but number one, we're losing a lot of detail on the flowers, which is a no-no. And the color just seems overall blue. So I brought it into RAW, and we're going to talk more about this in 2 weeks. So if you haven't signed up for Class 3, you need to sign up for Class 3. And using the 4 goals of RAW, even though it's not a RAW file, we were able to bring a lot more information back into it. Here's another way to look at it. Here's the histogram for this image. Here's before, and you can see it's starting to clip on both sides. And here's after, where I brought more pixels into the visible spectrum, leaning towards the center to the left-hand side of your histogram. And that's what RAW is all about right there. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a levels adjustment layer. And again, I use the adjustments panel, clicked on level, and it creates the adjustment layers. Whoops, I clicked on Hue saturation. Let's go back. There we go. There's levels. So now we have a little room to work with. Let's see how far we can go before we start throwing pixels out. I'm holding down the Option key, Alt on a PC, and I'm dragging the highlight or white slider to the left. Okay, now you can see we're starting to throw out some blue values. Probably not a big deal, but that's definitely probably about as far as we're going to want to go. And you can see already what a difference that makes. Now let's see what we're going to throw out on the, well, we're already oversaturated in the red, if you ask me, and we're going to use the Hue saturation to take care of that. But I'm going to go ahead and bring this over a little bit so we have some black and some bottom end to this image. Again, we started with this. Actually, we started with this. Not shown in the history, but done like we're going to do on Class 3 is what I did this. New adjustment layer, levels, modified it again. Now I'm going to take Ye Olde Magic Move, which is this middle slider, the mid-tone contrast, and I'm going to just move it a couple clicks over to the right. By the way, I should have mentioned it. There's 2 ways to adjust all of these that we're talking about. One is to move the sliders, which is what you've seen me do. The other is, I'm going to do this now, is to click into the box below the slider and use your arrow keys. You can see it went from 0.96 to 0.97. But look at the difference in the image. There's before and there's after. It just gives it a little bit of dimension to it. Let's go ahead and create a Hue Saturation Adjustment layer. You can see it does that. I have it active. The properties come up here. The only thing that bugs me on this one is mainly the reds, or something is too electric. Let's start with magenta and see how much of that. Oh, see, it's quite a bit. So I'm going to desaturate the magentas. I don't need to change the hue of the magenta. I just don't want it electric. And then let's go to reds and see how much we can get away with there. I don't want to mess up the colors in the flowers, but you get the idea. So there's before and there's after. So if I take these 2, whoops, these 3 actually, and put them in a group, this is what I got from Joe. And after doing all the work, this is what I ended up with. And you see how much more color that we have to work with that we didn't have? We've got lots of punch to this thing we just did not have. So I hope that would make sense. Okay, Priscilla, this is one of your images. I'm just going to close this. You guys get the idea, or you're going to learn it next class. Either way, this is what Priscilla gave me, and this is what I did to it in the Adobe, in Camera Raw filter in Photoshop, because this was also originally not a raw file. And one of the ways you can tell is because it is an 8-bit. You can see up here, we talked about the document window information in class 1, that this is in an 8-bit image, just so you know. So let's go ahead and create a levels. And you can see, if you look at the histogram up here, this actually is a pretty decent exposure. Here's before and here's after. And I really didn't do too much other than just kind of punch the colors up a little bit in the Adobe Camera Raw plugin. Well, I'm sorry, in the Camera Raw filter. Whoops, I don't want that. Let's go to levels. And again, I'm gonna hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and drag that over as far as I can. And I'm losing a little bit of red, but I don't think that we're losing anything important in the way of red. I don't want to wash out all the fine detail in here, because that's one of the things that I was able to bring back. And then we'll do a little bit on this side here on the shadow area. And again, it's throwing out some yellow at the bottom, again, in the shadow area. Again, not a problem. And again, ye old magic move. I am going to click on the box below. Remember, there are 2 ways. One is to move the slider, and the other is to click in the box below it. And I'm just going to use my arrow keys to bring this down to where I get the image that I want. So here's before, and there's after. And I'm not sure I really need to do too much in the way of Hue Saturation, but let's see what happens if we take some of the red out of here. Maybe it's not so much the straw, it's this area right in here. Maybe even the bottom of this ladder, to me, looks a little red. Again, am I being picky? Yeah, but that's okay. I want you guys to get the idea of what you can do with your images. And again, we're not doing anything in layer mask or zoning our image out into different zones. These are good images, by the way. Here's what we started with. Let me put that in a group. Here's before, and there's after. That's cool. Whatever it is, it's cool, Priscilla. But you can see how much more color we were able to bring in to this image because we brought the information in through raw. Okay, this is for Patrick. Nice image, Patrick. This was from a raw file originally. You can see it's in 16-bit, and I left it in 16-bit. The things that we needed to do to it in raw, right there. So we're bringing more information in, particularly these nifty flowers in here. So I'll create a levels adjustment layer. And again, the same thing. I'll hold down the Option key while I'm dragging the highlights and the shadow sliders. Alt in a PC to check for clipping. That's probably about right. We'll do the same thing on this side to give it some depth in the darker areas. We're losing detail in shadow detail in this little area between the cactus, but I don't think that's an issue. I think I'd rather see more pop in the darker areas. And again, I am using the arrow keys on the mid-tone slider, and here's before, and there's after. I'm not sure I would want to do anything to the color other than to see if maybe we can get a little more yellow out. I'm on the I created a Hue Saturation Adjustment layer. I dropped down to yellows, and I'm going to oversaturate to a degree anyway the yellows that are showing up in the throat of the flower on the tips of the leaves. So it's not much, doesn't take much. There's before and there's after. So we took this image, which looked like this. This is what the raw, all I did was took the raw file, opened it in raw, and hit OK. So this is what it actually looked like in raw before I did anything to it. Then after adjusting it in raw and doing a levels and Hue Saturation, we end up with that. That's a dynamite image. That has all sorts of possibilities. Oh, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, these are fun images. You guys always give me so much fun stuff, and gals. I know that may sound sexist. I'm just old-fashioned. Sorry. You people, all you people out there have really nifty images. We have a couple of Priscilla images. There we go. Okay. this is what I started with. And just by adjusting it in raw, able to bring in, at first I thought it was black and white, and I'm going, no, there is some really kind of fun little yellow warm colors in here. Now I flattened out all these wiggly lines, but that's okay. Here's what working in Photoshop will do. This is on the UCSD campus. So again, the same thing. I'm going to start with adjusting the shadow or dark slider first. Okay, there's a little peak of black right here, and it's just this little area up here. There's no detail in it. It really does nothing to the image overall, so I don't care if that clips. But if I start going like this, then we're going to start having some problems. And generally speaking, the higher the peak of the histogram as you bring your image in, the more you're going to throw out. Of course, that makes sense, I think. Let's do the same thing over here with the white, holding down the Option key, Alt on a PC. And we've got a window over there, which again, it doesn't make any difference. There's no detail in there to begin with. So that's probably about right there. We'll take the midtone slider. I'm going to click on that and just use my, there we go. And there's before and after. Now let's take the Hue Saturation. And what happens if we pump up the yellow on this? Well, that's kind of interesting. My point is, I'm not sure that that's really what we want to do, but you can see that it adds an element of color to it that was there but wasn't showing up in the original raw. And it was nothing wrong with their capture. It was, in fact, it was pretty darn good exposure. It was just the fact that I was trying to get as much color out of that. Exactly, like Priscilla says, you can play a lot with this image. So let's look at that. When you guys see me do this and I'm taking all those and putting them in their own group, it's just a technique. It's not anywhere in the book. I'm just trying to make it so that we can look at, this is the original image. This is what it looked like in RAW before I worked on it. And that's what we end up with. See how much more pop that has to it? The contrast is right. It's got color. If we don't like the color, we can back off. If we want to increase the color, we can do. If we want to warm it up, cool it down, whatever. But because we brought the information into Photoshop correctly, everybody's a happy camper. This is another Joe image. This is what she gave me as a JPEG. I saved this as a TIFF and then brought information back in to make it easier to work with. So let's go ahead and start with a levels adjustment layer. And again, I'll move that over. And the same thing over on this side. We're throwing out a little bit of the orange color, but I don't think that's really a big issue, not for the betterment of the overall image. And the only other thing I think I would do, I'll add a Hue Saturation Adjustment. What would happen if we brought down the magenta? Let's see how much of it. Oh yeah, see that background, that table is pink, and I don't think it's supposed to be. So I'm going to go ahead and desaturate that. You can see before and after. Other than that, I'm not sure I'd do a whole bunch. Maybe what would happen if we took the yellow and changed the hue on this to, instead of an orange, more of a, see, it's also affecting the drink, so I don't want to get real crazy with it, but that gives you an idea of what we can do with that. And again, we have not broken that up into any kind of zones at all. So here's what we started with. And there's what we end up with. A lot more color pop. It just jumps off the table at you. And the table's gray now. So and let's see, this is for Mary. This was a TIFF that I got originally, but this is what I started with here. So I went in and obviously really flattened out the contrast so that we could see shadow detail and more highlights without them looking on the washed out side. Now, what we do is we create a levels adjustment layer. This one's radically different. It really looks good. And now I'm throwing out a little red values, but nothing major. In fact, if anything, and we'll get to that next, we might want to change that yellow to where it's a little less orange yellow and more green yellow, just so that it, well, it doesn't look orange. So there's before and after. And if I take, actually, I can probably do this a little more. There we go. And I'll take Hue Saturation, and let's go to yellows. And I'm going to change the hue on this. See, I can go, make all the yellow red. We don't want to do that. We don't want to make it all green either. But somewhere in there, there's a point where it's going to look, and it actually doesn't look too bad, but I'm wondering, I'm going to click in here. Remember, you can use the arrow keys, and I'm going to add the greenish hue a little bit until it looks too green. And it didn't take much. It only took 2 units, but that really does make a big difference. See that? There's after, there's before. So we basically took these 3. I started with this. Look at that, boys and girls. I mean, you can see all this detail in the tree, and I know that, you know, it needs some cropping and what have you, but just the fact that we have plenty of information to play with, you can see the difference. It's a big difference. Even the green in the tree looks green. Instead of here, it looks almost grayish black. Yeah, let's see, I think we got 2 more. Well, I'm going to open both of these at the same time, just save us some time. Trish, let me put this over here for a second. Okay, another Priscilla image here. This was, again, a raw file. And we started with this, which has all sorts of intriguing possibilities. And as soon as I adjusted it in raw, you can see that it opened up the shadow detail and brought down all of this nifty detail. Ballast Brewery, I take it that's here in San Diego? Too many beers. She says too many beers. Oh, you meant that it's crooked? No, you meant to do that, of course. Okay, so let's go ahead and adjust the levels adjustment layer. This is a good example. You see how in the histogram there's a little peak right there? What that peak is probably these 3 plates that go across here that don't have any detail in them. So I don't care if I throw out information in that. So for the betterment of the image, I'm going to bring it more to the left. There's before and there's after. Now let's see what happens when we bring some bottom end into this, particularly in the shadow area. And again, we can bring quite a bit before it even starts to lose pixels. And I'm holding down the Option key, Alt on a PC. And let's go, here's before and after. Let's see what happens if we can, this is just another idea. There's color in here we didn't even know about. There's some yellow in here and there's some red back in there. So let's see what happens if we punch up. Let's start with the reds and see if we can give that any more. Well, it is actually helping. I'm going to add, what, 15 or 20 units of saturation. You got that. It's actually picking up some red back there too, which I didn't even see. There's before and after. And then what happens with the yellows. I'm afraid the yellow is going to affect the gray. Oh, it doesn't. But again, we can punch up the colors on this little bucket that's right down here. So here's before and there's after. So again, if we take those 3 layers, what we did in raw and the levels in Hue Saturation and group those together, you can see this is what it looked like before we worked on it in raw. And this is what it looks like after the fact. That looks pretty cool. Last, but certainly not least. And in fact, I didn't get this one until today, but I did get it, Patricia. And I believe, whoops, this was, oh, I guess it was a JPEG. I don't remember if it was a JPEG or what it was. Oh, it was a JPEG. Okay, here's before. This is what Patricia gave me. And this is what I did is I brought highlight detail back in, particularly in that bridge. And even in the sky, there's now a little bit of blue to work with, which wasn't there before. And so now I'm going to go ahead and use a levels adjustment layer, hold down the Option key, and drag that to the left. Maybe a little much. And see what happens to it after we add some bottom into this. I'm going to move the shadow slider in, and let's see, we're dumping a little bit of green there, but I don't think it's a major deal at all. But I bet this slider is really going to make a difference. So here's before, there's after, and then let's say on the Hue Saturation, we want to try to pump up that, I don't know if we can pump up that green water, make it look like St. Patty's Day. No, okay, that looks terrible. But you get the idea. If you wanted to punch that green up, you could, because the scalpel will only affect the green values. We'll give it a little bit. It isn't hurting anything. What happens if we punch up the yellows while I'm thinking about it? Oh, that's kind of nice, punching up the yellows, except this house back here, I don't know if it's really yellow, it's probably white, but everything else looks like the sun is really shining and what have you. Okay, so we started with this. And ended up with that. Not bad, eh? That looks pretty good, actually. All right, I think we covered all of it. If anybody has any questions, let me know. Don't forget your homework, folks. I know it makes a difference because I've heard from some people that said, wow, that's really cool. There's lots of blogs and videos for the homework. And yes, if anybody needs any kind of printing, I am printing at this point, and just let me know. Thanks a lot, folks. Really appreciate y'all being here tonight. God bless.